Welcome back. So glad you're joining us for today's Explainer. We are diving into a really massive policy issue today, the efficacy of India's poverty alleviation programs. And look, we're going to tackle this from all angles. We'll look at the undeniable, monumental successes that literally changed millions of lives. But we're also going to get real about the massive systemic limitations that kept these policies from entirely wiping out poverty. It's a giant puzzle and, honestly, a fascinating debate. So let's just jump right in. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. We're looking at the anti-poverty policy debate, the structural victories in data, the systemic failures and bottlenecks, the core strategy flaw, and finally, the solution framework. Starting right off with Section 1, the anti-poverty policy debate. So think about interventions on a staggering scale. We're talking about reaching millions of landless agricultural laborers, marginal farmers, village artisans, and tribal communities across an entire subcontinent. It's huge. But that brings us to a really fundamental question. Why do these massive poverty alleviation programs so often fall short of complete eradication? We constantly see these grandiose government goals launched with all this fanfare, right? But then, when we look at the grounded economic reality, there's this massive gap. What is causing that friction between the policy on paper and the real-world results? Keep that question in the back of your mind as we go. Moving on to Section 2, structural victories and data. Now, before we get heavily into the critiques, we absolutely have to establish a baseline here to understand the monumental scale of what these programs actually achieved. 55%. Just think about that number. Back in 1973 and 74, a staggering 55% of the population was living below the poverty line. That means more than half the country literally couldn't afford the bare minimum calories needed to survive. Try to conceptualize the sheer mountain that economic policymakers had to climb. I mean, this wasn't just a tough policy challenge, it was a full-blown existential crisis for the nation's development. And this brilliantly illustrates what is honestly a monumental structural victory. We drop from that terrifying 55% down to roughly 22% by 2011 to 2012. That is a 33 percentage point drop. To put that into perspective, it's one of the most significant shifts in economic well-being in modern history. And the data shows this decrease was heavily driven by the poverty alleviation programs. Let's break those quantitative wins down even further. First off, these programs drove literally half of the recent income growth for the poor. That's huge. Second, they successfully pushed market wages higher, especially in historically backward regions where wages had essentially been stuck in the mud for decades. And crucially, they established a measurable nutritional floor. They fundamentally improved the baseline calorie intake and nutritional security of the absolute poorest individuals. Make no mistake, these are undeniable, massive structural triumphs. Which brings us to Section 3, systemic failures and bottlenecks. So, if the programs were this successful, why didn't they just wipe poverty out completely? Well, to answer that, we have to ruthlessly examine the limitations. Actually, it's a lot about administrative friction. Treating poverty at a national scale requires a smooth, well-oiled administrative machine. But on the ground, these programs are riddled with procedural bottlenecks. We're talking about extremely inefficient implementing staff who are bogged down by ridiculously complex procedural requirements. And the kicker? There's a severe lack of monitoring machinery or follow-up action. Without tracking, there's zero accountability, and the whole machine just grinds to a halt. Now, what's really interesting here is this bitter irony, where the actual definition of poverty becomes a vulnerability. On one hand, you have the targeted intended beneficiaries, the people who genuinely need the help. But on the other hand, because the parameters are often vague and unscientific, a huge number of non-poor individuals are able to game the system. This creates massive leakages, rampant corruption, and incredibly inefficient management. It literally siphons critical resources away from the very people who desperately need them. And then we hit a massive systemic flaw, the geographic blind spot. Poor households located in remote, tribal, or highly inaccessible villages have essentially faced total neglect. I mean, because they lack basic physical accessibility, like simple all-weather roads, and because of sheer systemic ignorance from central planning hubs, the absolute poorest households are completely locked out. They can't even access the very programs that were specifically designed to save them. It's a massive blind spot. All right, moving to Section 4, the core strategy flaw. Let's elevate this debate and look at the overarching economic philosophy behind these policies. Think of it like a medical analogy. On one hand, we have a direct attack on poverty. This is what these programs do by handing out direct benefits or setting up temporary jobs. But here's the thing, that is just treating the symptom. On the other hand, we have the modification of the overall economy, which means changing the underlying structures that cause the poverty in the first place. That is treating the actual disease. So, the crucial point is captured perfectly in this idea from the source material. Poverty is the outcome of the way the economy functions. I want to let that sink in for a second. You simply cannot fix poverty long-term without fixing the macroeconomic machine that generates it. Giving people direct handouts is absolutely crucial for immediate survival, no doubt about it. But it doesn't change the fundamental way the economy operates. And because policymakers rely so heavily on that direct attack strategy, they end up making some pretty critical miscalculations. First off, this strategy completely fails to address exploitative rural agencies. Think of predatory moneylenders who trap the poor in endless cycles of debt. Second, it falsely assumes that the extremely poor just inherently possess the physical stamina, the technical skill, and the capital required to take full advantage of these benefits. And finally, it's a completely top-down approach. These programs are usually government-sponsored mandates pushed out with little to zero consultation with the local communities themselves. Let's move to Section 5, the solution framework. Let's see how this builds into a cohesive, two-pronged solution. Moving from critique to actionable remedies, how do we actually fix this? Step 1 requires a massive perspective shift. We have to integrate poverty alleviation programs directly into the broader macroeconomic development strategy. They simply cannot operate in a silo anymore. And Step 2 focuses on the grassroots. We must revitalize Panchayati Raj institutions. We've got to move away from these top-down central government mandates and put the actual distribution power, the consultation, and the implementation right back into the hands of local communities who actually understand their own specific needs. Which brings us to the end of our critical assessment today, and I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. When you look at the policies being debated in the news right now, based on everything we've just uncovered about systemic flaws and treating root causes, ask yourself, are our modern policies truly curing the disease of poverty, or are we just managing its symptoms? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer today. Keep asking those tough questions, and I'll catch you next time.